Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to explore humanity's long and, let's be honest, terrifying history with natural disasters. And we're going to look at this deep-seated need we seem to have to record them, a journey that takes us from personal horror to, well, planetary data. All right, let's dive right in. Our story really kicks off more than 300 years ago with this incredibly powerful statement. It's all about the duty of a historian, right? It's basically a declaration that what you write down, what you record, carries this huge responsibility, not just for right now, but for everyone who comes after. Okay, picture this. It's October 17th, 1989, an absolutely perfect fall day in the San Francisco Bay Area. We've got over 62,000 fans jammed in Candlestick Park and literally millions more watching on TV. Why? It's the Bay Bridge World Series, the Oakland A's versus the San Francisco Giants, a historic match. But then at 5:04 p.m., the ground itself starts to heave, and the biggest game of the year suddenly becomes a tiny footnote to history. And this is the exact moment it all began. You're listening to the legendary sportscaster Al Michaels, live on national television. And right in the middle of a sentence, the broadcast booth starts shaking violently. If you were watching, you saw the TV picture just flicker, and then static. The feed went completely dead for 15 absolutely terrifying seconds. A massive earthquake was ripping through the region, and the entire world had a front row seat for the second it started. But here's the incredible, mind-bending paradox at the heart of this whole story. Even though the quake caused so much tragedy, the very thing that had the world's attention, that World Series game, actually stopped a much worse catastrophe from happening. And that leads us to this unbelievable question. How? How on earth did a baseball game, of all things, end up saving the Bay Area on its darkest day? To really understand what happened at 5:00 for that evening, we have to look deep underground. You see, the incredible beauty of the Bay Area is sitting right on top of a restless, colossal geologic power source. And for over 80 years, it had been silently, steadily building up pressure. And this is the prime mover behind it all, the San Andreas Fault. It's this 800-mile-long scar running right through California. And it's where two gigantic tectonic plates, the Pacific and North American plates, are constantly grinding past each other. Now, most of the time, they're stuck. They're locked together, just building up more and more strain. And when that strain finally lets go, well, that's when you get an earthquake. So this brings us to a really fascinating and kind of scary concept called the seismic gap. See, after that monster 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the part of the fault down under the Santa Cruz Mountains just went quiet, ominously quiet. And seismologists knew this was not a good thing. It meant that section was locked tight, basically winding up like a giant coiled spring, just storing up energy. They even gave it a name, the Loma Prieta segment. And you can just see the buildup happening over time. Right here, after all those quiet decades, the fault started to stir. First, a 5.3 magnitude quake in June of '88. Then, an even stronger 5.4 quake in August of '89, just 2 months before the big one. These were foreshocks, little warnings, really, that the massive spring was getting ready to snap. And then, at 5:04 p.m. on October 17th, it happened. That coiled spring finally snapped. All that energy, all that pressure that had been building since 1906 was unleashed in just a handful of seconds. The raw power was just staggering. The quake clocked in at a 6.9 on the moment magnitude scale. That's the modern scale, the one that measures the total energy an earthquake releases. The rupture started 12 miles below the surface, and it sent these incredible shock waves out in every direction, shaking the entire Bay Area from Monterey all the way up past San Francisco. Just 15 seconds. That's how long the most violent shaking lasted. Think about that. In less time than it takes to tie your shoes, entire freeway sections came crashing down. Buildings were literally jolted off their foundations, and the landscape of the Bay Area was just changed forever. But here's the thing. The damage wasn't even close to being uniform. So why did some places get totally flattened, while other nearby spots were okay? The answer is all about geology. If your house was on solid bedrock, you felt less intense shaking. But if you were in an area built on artificial landfill or soft bay mud, well, that was a whole different story. That soft ground acted like a bowl of jello, amplifying the waves. And in some spots, the ground itself failed in this wild process called liquefaction, where solid, water-saturated dirt basically turns into a liquid. And this difference in geology, well, it led to some absolutely catastrophic failures that became the defining, tragic images of the Loma Prieta earthquake. Two locations in particular really tell the story of this disaster. First up, San Francisco's Marina District. And talk about a cruel twist of irony. This whole neighborhood was built on landfill that was partly made of rubble from the 1906 earthquake. So when the shaking started, that ground just liquefied. You had these soft-story buildings with big, open garages on the ground floor that just pancaked down onto the cars below. And to make matters worse, gas lines broke, sparking these massive fires that just raged through the night. And then there was the Cypress Street Viaduct in Oakland, a double-decker freeway. Now, it was built on old marshland, so the shaking was amplified there too. Its support columns were built to an older code. They were strong enough to hold up cars, sure, but they didn't have the flexible steel inside needed to sway with the quake's motion. So they just shattered, and the whole top deck came crashing down onto the bottom deck, trapping commuters inside. And this was the devastating human cost. All told, 63 people lost their lives. But just look at where those tragedies happened. The data here tells a brutal story. A staggering 42 of those deaths, that's 67% of the total, happened in that one spot, in the collapse of the Cypress Viaduct. Which brings us right back to our central question. At 4 minutes past 5 on a Tuesday afternoon, the Cypress Viaduct and every other freeway in the Bay Area should have been bumper to bumper with rush hour traffic. But they weren't. Why? Because of the World Series. People had left work early. They'd gone home. They were at parties to watch the game. And because of that, traffic was unusually light. This single twist of fate, this baseball game, without a doubt saved hundreds, maybe even thousands of lives that in the days, months, and years that followed. The Bay Area didn't just rebuild, it was fundamentally transformed. The earthquake was a massive wake-up call that completely reshaped the region's infrastructure. And honestly, its whole attitude about living on a fault line. The total price tag for property damage was estimated at $6 billion. To put that in perspective, that's over $15 billion in today's money. At the time, it was one of the most expensive natural disasters in the history of the United States. And this led to some of the biggest, most permanent changes to the Bay Area's landscape. Major freeways that got damaged, they weren't even repaired, they were torn down completely. The quake gave cities like San Francisco and Oakland the political push they needed to get rid of these ugly, elevated freeways that had cut through neighborhoods for decades, opening up beautiful waterfronts and creating brand new boulevards. Now, the Bay Bridge shut down for a whole month for repairs. Public transit suddenly became the region's lifeline. Daily ridership on the BART train system shot up by over 50%. Hundreds of thousands of commuters had to find a new way to get around. And it became this huge, unplanned experiment in mass transit. But maybe the most important legacy of all is the one you can't always see. The earthquake laid bare just how vulnerable the region's infrastructure was. It kicked off this massive multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar effort to seismically retrofit every single major bridge, overpass, and public utility to withstand the big one that everyone knows is coming. Which leaves us with this final thought. The lessons from Loma Prieta were learned at a terrible price. But they forced the Bay Area to become a world leader in earthquake engineering and preparedness. The region is, without a doubt, stronger and safer than it was in 1989. But the San Andreas Fault is still down there, still building up stress, reminding everyone that the question isn't if the next big one will hit, but when, over 200 years ago, a series of earthquakes shook the American heartland so violently that they actually made the Mississippi River run backward. It's an incredible story that's been mostly forgotten, but the ground deep beneath the central U.S. definitely hasn't. So let's get into it. This is the story of America's sleeping giant. Just try to imagine this for a second. You're asleep on a boat floating down the Mississippi, and you're jolted awake by that. That's the real experience of a naturalist named John Bradbury, way back in 1811. And he wasn't caught in some freak storm. He was caught in the middle of a geological event of historic proportions, 0.2:00 in the morning. That's when the shaking began for the settlers scattered across the American frontier. This was no small tremor. This was the beginning of an absolute nightmare, a winter of pure terror. And the thing is, this wasn't just a one-and-done event. Not even close. What we're talking about is a relentless, terrifying sequence of quakes and aftershocks that just kept the ground moving for months on end. Okay, so just look at this timeline. The first big one hits just after 2 a.m. in total darkness. Then only 6 hours later, right as the sun's coming up, bam, another massive one hits. Then another monster quake in January. And finally, the catastrophic one in early February. This wasn't just an earthquake. It was a sustained assault by the Earth itself. So, while John Bradbury was out on the river, Eliza Bryan was in the town of New Madrid. And her account, well, it paints a picture of just pure chaos on land. You've got people screaming and running everywhere, with no idea what to do or where to go. Animals are going crazy, trees are cracking and falling down. The world was literally breaking apart all around them. That last major shock on February 7th, that was the knockout punch. It completely leveled the town of New Madrid, the place that gives these quakes their name. And its power was so immense that it was toppling chimneys hundreds of miles away in St. Louis. The damage to the towns was one thing, but what these earthquakes did to the actual landscape is just almost impossible to believe. The world was literally remade in a matter of months. And here's maybe the most famous and, frankly, the wildest effect of all, also described by Eliza Bryan. The Mississippi River flowed backward. No, that's not a hallucination. The quake physically shoved the riverbed upward with so much force that it created temporary waterfalls and sent massive waves flowing upstream, actually reversing the flow of America's mightiest river. I mean, the quakes literally redrew the map. Over in Tennessee, the ground just dropped 20 feet, and the Mississippi rushed in to form what we now call Reelfoot Lake, an entire lake created in an instant. Islands in the river, they just vanished. Farmland was completely ruined when the shaking turned solid ground into a liquid mush, forcing sand and water to erupt from below. It was a complete and permanent transformation of the land. You know, all of this just begs a huge question. When we think of massive earthquakes, we think of California, we think of Japan, but Missouri, how could one of the most powerful seismic events in history happen right in the middle of a continent, thousands of miles from any tectonic plate boundary? Well, to understand why, you have to get a sense of the scale. The shaking from New Madrid was felt over an area of about 1 million square miles. Compare that to the famous 1906 San Francisco quake, which was felt over about 6,200 square miles. The reason for the massive difference? The Earth's crust in the central U.S. is older and colder, so it transmits seismic energy incredibly well. It basically rings like a giant bell. And the culprit behind it all is a deep, hidden weakness called the Reelfoot Rift. So, about 750 million years ago, the continent actually tried to rip itself apart right here. It failed, but it left behind a deep scar, a whole network of faults. And it's that ancient wound that ruptured so violently in 1811 that, make no mistake, this rift is not dormant. Since scientists installed modern seismographs back in 1974, they've detected over 4,000 earthquakes in this zone. Now, the vast majority are way too small to feel, but they're a constant reminder that the fault system is active and that it's still building up stress that us owe. This brings us from history right to the present day, because the very same forces that caused the terror of 1811 are still at work deep underground, right now as we speak. So what's the risk today? Well, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, there's a 25% to 40% chance of a magnitude 6.0 or greater earthquake hitting this region within the next 50 years. That is a significant probability of a very, very damaging event happening in our lifetimes. And what would that actually look like today? FEMA does not mince words on this. They've stated that because the region isn't built to the same seismic standards as, say, California, a major quake there could cause, and I quote, the highest economic losses due to a natural disaster in the United States. The damage would be, in their words, widespread and catastrophic. So the story of New Madrid isn't just history, it's a warning. It's a powerful reminder that some of the biggest dangers are the ones we can't even see buried deep beneath our feet, just waiting for the pressure to build. So the question isn't really if it will happen again, it's when, there are some forces in the world that are just so immense, so incredibly powerful. They kind of remind us of our place in the universe. They shape our world, and they shape our history. Today, we're going to dive into the stories of one of those forces, the North American blizzard. But that brings up a really big question, right? When you're faced with something that massive, how do you even begin to wrap your head around it? How do we measure it, record it, and tell its story? That's exactly what we're going to get into, Douglas. Let's start with our first chronicle from an era of what they called white hurricanes. I mean, that name says it all, doesn't it? This isn't just a snowstorm. It's about pure, raw, earthly fury, all recorded long before we had fancy weather satellites. Check out this timeline of some of the heavy hitters from back then. And notice the year 1888. What a brutal year. 2 monster blizzards, just months apart. First, the schoolhouse blizzard hit the plains so fast it trapped kids in their schools. Then, the Great White Hurricane literally buried the entire Northeast. The thing about these storms was just how sudden and totally devastating they were on a local level. Let's zoom in on one of these. The Knickerbocker storm in 1922. Now, this one wasn't a sprawling giant, but what it did to Washington, D.C. was just profound. It dropped this incredibly heavy wet snow, and that's the dangerous stuff. It's like concrete falling from the sky. And this is the real human cost, boiled down to one single heartbreaking number: 98. That's how many people died when the roof of the Knickerbocker Theater just gave way under all that weight. One building, one failure, and a tragedy that would define the entire storm. Now listen to this quote about that other storm from 1888. Snow drifts over 50 feet. I mean, seriously, just try to picture that. That's not a snow day, that's not an inconvenience, that is civilization grinding to a dead halt in the face of nature's power. Okay, so let's jump forward to the modern era. The story of blizzards really starts to change here because with our modern world, with all our interconnected highways and supply chains, the big story isn't just about local damage anymore, it's about massive, widespread disruption. And this table here just nails that shift perfectly. Look at the 1993 storm of the century versus Snowzilla in 2016. Their impact is measured in scope. The 93 storm was this sprawling monster that stretched from Alabama all the way to Maine, and it had tornadoes mixed in with the blizzard. Then you got Snowzilla, whose whole claim to fame was shutting down the entire mid-Atlantic corridor. It's all about massive disruption to our modern way of life. And then there was this absolute beast, the 2011 Groundhog Day blizzard. If we're talking about scope, this thing is a legend. 28 states. Just let that sink in for a second. One single weather system hitting nearly 2/3 of the continental US. That is just insane. And the details, they're just wild. We're talking about wind gusts like a hurricane, thunder snow in Chicago, which is a sign of a seriously intense storm. And of course, who can forget that iconic image of hundreds of cars just stranded overnight on Lakeshore Drive? It was a perfect symbol of modern life, completely frozen in its tracks. And the cost? Now, we measure it in billions of dollars. And to put it in perspective for just one city, take a look at this. The 2011 storm wasn't technically the biggest snowfall Chicago had ever seen. The 67 blizzard still holds that record. But man, got incredibly close. And this is why it all matters so much. The chronicles of past blizzards help us forecast future storms. The logs of planets help us navigate the cosmos. It all comes from that same fundamental need to observe and record and understand. And that kind of leaves us with one big final thought, doesn't it? What chronicles are we writing today? And what stories will they tell tomorrow?